everybody. My name is John Leslie, and I am the host of Talking About Radio. And today, I am my guest. I've had quite a number of people ask me about my background in broadcasting. We've got quite a number of our new podcasts talking about radio up on our platform, and they are downloaded from all over the world. It's just amazing. I spent over 50 years, probably close to 60 years, in what's called terrestrial radio, sitting in a studio doing news, broadcasting music, and all kinds of things. And I thought I had retired from this a number of years ago, and my long time friend and former business partner, John Morgan, who lives in Cranston, Rhode Island, and had worked at some of the finest radio stations in the country, and oftentimes was considered to be the top oldies program director in the nation, has been after me for about a year to do a podcast, and I really didn't know what I could do that would be of interest to the general public. And perhaps talking about radio is not of interest to the general public, but it's amazing, just absolutely amazing, the number of downloads that we have received on these programs, and again from all over the world. So I really don't get a chance, other than when we're doing our interviews, I get a chance to throw in a few comments here and there, but I really don't have an opportunity to tell the audience much about my broadcasting history. Like so many of the people that we interview, and I mean like many of the people that we interview, my interest in broadcasting started back when I was 7, 8, 9 years old. I would listen to radio, and I would hear these faraway stations. And you ask any of the people that we talk to, and it's typically the same stations. On the East Coast, we listened to WLS, and we listened to KDKA in Pittsburgh. That was the station that I really wanted to work at. Always wanted to do mornings at KDKA in Pittsburgh. And WBZ in Boston, WTIC in Hartford, those big 50,000 watt stations that would boom in, and Detroit, the stations there. And I would listen to them, and I'd say, one of these days, that's going to be me. And I never knew for certain that that was really going to be me. But just like those big stations that I listened to off in the distance during the nighttime hours, our local stations were just as important to me and to the community at that time. I was born and raised in a steel town in northern West Virginia. The name of the city is Weirton, West Virginia. It's in the shadow of Pittsburgh, about, I'm guessing 20, 25 miles west of Pittsburgh. And our local radio stations were WEIR in Weirton, West Virginia, and WSTV in Steubenville, Ohio, which was right across the river from Weirton. One of the famous people who came out of Steubenville, Ohio, was Dean Martin. In any event, KDKA was also, that was a local station, although it was a 50,000 watt station. It would come in and service our area, but it was our local station, WEIR, that was the most important to the community, and everybody listened to it. It was always on in the barber shops, and if you went into stores, into any of the merchants, they would have WEIR on in the background. And I knew the names of all of the guys who were all the talent that was on the air there. And so I wanted to do that. Every time they had a remote broadcast or they were out on a personal appearance, these local celebrities, I would have my parents take me to wherever it was, and I would watch from a distance. I never went up to them and said, "Hey, my name," well, actually, my family name it's kind of hard to remember. It's a big, long Czechoslovakian name. Jan Kokachak was my family name. My middle name, Leslie. And so I would go off to these events, and I'd see these people, and I would watch from a distance, and it was like I was watching big Hollywood celebrities. And so time went around, and everybody seemed to think that the future of all the people in Weirton was to work in the mill, work in the steel mill. There were many thousands of mostly men, some women, who worked in the mill, and they would go off to college after high school and come back and work in the mill. But I never wanted to do that. I wanted to work in broadcasting. So I started hanging around the radio station trying to work my way in there, and I would get in. I was very fortunate when I was in high school. The broadcast team, the play-by-play football team, uh, for the radio station needed a spotter, somebody who goes with them to the various football games and watch the field and point to a list of names and point to the person who made the tackle or the pass or the play, so that the play-by-play guy didn't have to memorize all of those names. So I travel. They called the high school, and the radio station called the high school and said, we need somebody to be a spotter for our broadcast team. And it was just like a miracle, like magic. The principal of the high school came to me and she said, the football play-by-play team needs a spotter. That was my foot in the door. I mean, it just like it fell out of heaven. And so I would travel around with the football team. I got to know a few of the guys, and it was just like magic to me. I would be with them, and it was just so warm, so compelling, so magnetic that I just couldn't believe that I actually had an opportunity to get in close to these guys and get close and get in the station and be known. Well, I was too young. They never wanted to hire me. And so I would hang around the station. I learned how to run all of the production room equipment, and I did my little DJ work in there. And then sometimes I knew that I was in the way, and I'd go into the studio in the evening and sit with the guys who were on the air in the evening or on the weekends. And finally, they asked me to quit coming in. They said, "You're getting in the way. You're working with the equipment, and you're leaving it in the wrong position. And we're coming in the morning, and things are out of whack." So they asked me to leave, and I cried. I just couldn't believe that I had gotten that close and then was expelled. Well, I don't even remember now. It seems to me like I just defied them. It seems to me like I just kept coming back. And I would get there and the door would be locked, and then the poor guys on the air would feel sorry for me and let me in. And finally, one day it happened. They had an opening on the weekend, and it was not a disc jockey job. In those days, our station, WEIR in Weirton, West Virginia, was an NBC affiliate. And NBC had a program called Monitor, and it provided us with programming throughout the course of the weekend. So like 90% of the midday and afternoon programming on WEIR was this NBC Monitor. And so they needed somebody to be in the studio who could read the weather and do the station identification and all those other little chores during the breaks from Monitor. And that's what I did. That's how I got my foot in the door. And I would get all dressed up in a suit and tie and go in there on Sunday afternoon. And this was a big job for me. This was a gigantic step toward my career goal. Well, by the time I got out of high school and did a short stint in the Marine Corps, I went to basic training at Parris Island, South Carolina, and I was injured during a training accident and was discharged, honorably discharged from the Marine Corps with a disability. And so I came back, and when I got back, they had not saved my job for me like they were supposed to have, according to the veterans' laws that were on the books and still are. So I went to work at a radio station in Wheeling, West Virginia. I got a job in Wheeling, West, almost immediately, and it was like a 500-watt station, and it was album music, Engelbert Humperdinck and Nelson Riddle and Henry Mancini and stuff like that, which is really not the kind of thing that a guy my age, 18 years old, wanted to do, but it was a job in radio. The call letters were WBZE, very close to that big WBZ in Boston. But I was working at WBZE in afternoon drive, and I had been using the name Jan Leslie, my first name and middle name. And I dropped the Kokachak part because it was just too hard for people to remember and too easy to make fun of. So for years, I was Jan Leslie, and I worked at WBZE afternoons. And in the summertime, when it was light out until 8 or 9 o'clock, we were on the air till sundown. But in the wintertime, when the sun went down at 4:30, we signed off at sundown. So I had more work in the summer than I did in the winter. But they wouldn't let me use Jan Leslie. They wanted me to use the afternoon drive name Mr. Busy after the WBZ. So for a while, I was Mr. Busy. As time went on, I was approached by a radio station in the shadow of Pittsburgh, up north of Pittsburgh, Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. The station called it as we're WBVP, and the station logo or the moniker of the station was "We Boost Valley Progress." We boost Valley Progress, and that was the first time I worked on an AM and an FM station, and we were simulcasting AM and an FM at the same time. And the 2 or 3 guys that put that station on the air had worked in Pittsburgh, so they were really kind of major market guys, but they were all kind of a goofy bunch, but they served the community. And WBVP in Beaver County, Pennsylvania, served quite a large area. And again, it was a local station, and people would come to the promotions that we did, and the station, everybody did everything. The morning guy would do news after he got off the air, and the midday guy would do news before he got on the air. And I was really the only full-time news guy. And that's what I thought I was going to do in life, was be a news broadcaster. That had been my interest. I always, I chased ambulances, and I was in the volunteer fire service for 25 years or more, and was a deputy sheriff for about 4 years. That later in life, and I'll tell you about that a little bit. But I worked at WBVP, and I learned a lot, and it was a powerful station, and I realized the influence that radio stations had on the community. We had a lady by the name of Gertrude Trobe who did a cooking recipe kind of show on middays, and Gert would do every year at the Broadhead Hotel in Beaver Falls. That was the home of Joe Namath, and at the Broadhead Hotel, Gert would have this thing for all of her listeners, and thousands of women would come to this thing. That was the strength of that radio station. And everybody worked in this big, newspaper city room. All of the desks were in this big room. Everybody, the owner, the general manager, the news people, the salespeople, they were all in the same room, and everybody had a desk except Gertrude Trobe. She had her own office, a private office. And that was the only private office in the radio station. And that just underscored the power that she had. One of the things that the Gert would go in and do we had these big studios where one time they did, had local bands and things would come in and had mics hanging from the ceiling. And Gert would get on the air. She was a nice enough lady, but she didn't have a whole lot of broadcast savvy. And I always remember she always carried a hanky crumpled up in her hand, and she had this sinus drip problem. And she would go in and do her program, and she didn't know how to use the mic off and on switch. And so midway during her show, she would get this signage drip down into her throat, and she'd have to get rid of it. And she would do it right on the air. And you would hear her, I don't want to do it because I'll gag you, but you'd be driving along listening to her about, now you take 2 eggs, and then all of a sudden she would cut loose with these big hawking noises. And that's what that crumpled up handkerchief was for. Well, anyhow, I worked with a guy by the name of Larry Yeagley at WBVP, and Larry never really liked me all that much for some reason. It was kind of an off and on deal. He liked me, and then he didn't like me, and then he liked me, and he didn't like me. And so Larry was a college grad, was in news. He had a degree, and he was a pretty good writer. And all of a sudden, Larry gets a job opportunity at WFMJ TV 21 in Youngstown, Ohio, radio and television. And off he goes. He leaves WBVP, and he's off to Youngstown, Ohio, which is probably the nation's biggest medium-sized market. There's more crime goes on in Youngstown, Ohio than any other city I've ever seen. I mean, just day after day, there's some kind of big thing going on, and there was never any lack of news. My name's John Leslie. I'm the host of talking about radio, and I'm telling you a little bit about myself today, just so that when you listen to these programs, you have a sense of what I did during the course of my 50 plus years in broadcasting. So Larry went off to WFMJ, and all of a sudden, he recommends me for a job, a radio television job at WFMJ in Youngstown. I went up there, went in for the interview, and was hired. And now all of a sudden, I'm in what I consider to be a big market. Only it's an okay kind of big market or bigger market. And I'm in the newsroom. And before long, within a matter of a year or so, I was anchoring the television news. I did morning radio for a long time, and then I part of what I had to do was to go up into the announce booth for television, and they had a slide up during the Today Show, and it would say WFMJ News, and then I would read news, over that slide, and eventually, and then I would go out and do street reporting and my interviews and various stories made it, into the 6 o'clock news and the 11 o'clock news. And before long, Larry and I were co-anchoring the weekend news, Saturday and Sunday. He did the national report and I did the local news. And then it wasn't very long after that, Larry and I are anchoring the 11 o'clock television news on WFMJ TV in Youngstown, Ohio. And every night, Monday through Friday, off on Saturdays and Sundays. And well, maybe I worked Saturdays. I don't remember exactly. But anyhow, we were, and there's so many stories that go along with these, the things that happened during those times, I can't even, it would be forever for me trying. I'll tell you one story. I'll tell you this one. And this happened at WFMJ. I was getting ready that we had a 15-minute interview program that they did called Teleview. And it typically was done live, and they would interview somebody. It was during the midday, and they would bring somebody in. Some event was going on, and they would bring them in and interview them. And then it would sometimes they didn't have anybody, and they would record it later, and so on. Well, the Tonight Show band leader, Doc Severinsen, was in town to do a concert, or I don't know why he was in town. This is a long time ago. I don't remember why. But he was in town and they wanted to do a Teleview interview with him. And so the only time he could come in was like about 20 minutes to 6, the same studio where the news was going to be. And so they're interviewing Doc Severinsen, and they finished up just before the 6 o'clock news. And so I was in the studio getting ready to do my 6 o'clock show, the 6 o'clock news show. And I had a minute to talk to Doc Severinsen, and I said, "Hey, Doc," I said, "when I watch the Tonight Show and Ed McMahon is doing live commercials for like Alpo and things like that, why I said, he laughs sometimes. He cracks up and laughs. What is he laughing about?" And if you remember back, if you're old enough to remember back, Ed would laugh at these during these live commercials. And Doc Severinsen says, well, the reason he's laughing is because while he's doing the commercials, I get down on my hands and knees and crawl over and goose him while he's live on the air, and he laughs. Well, we had a good chuckle about that, right? So now it's time, boom, it's time for me to go on the air at 6 o'clock. And now WFMJ News, here's Jan Leslie. And I started the newscast, and I looked over out of the corner of my eye, and here comes Doc Severinsen crawling on his hands and knees toward me. We had a stand-up operation. We had podiums. We didn't sit down for the news. We were always standing up. And so he didn't even have to get close to me before I started laughing. All right. John Leslie is here's how I got to be John Leslie. After some time at WFMJ TV in Youngstown, Ohio, it was time for a move. I had to move up. And again, I considered myself to be a news guy. And so I applied for quite a number of jobs around the country. And I found an ad in Broadcasting Magazine, which was the big media radio and TV magazine of the era. And there was a company called Triangle Broadcasting. Now, you may or may not know Triangle. It probably dates back before a lot of you, and um, they owned stations all over the country, including WFIL in Philadelphia, where American Bandstand originated. And Dick Clark was an air staff member at WFIL, Triangle Broadcasting. And they had stations in Fresno and Altoona, Pennsylvania, and I don't know where all. But that this particular station, it was in Binghamton, New York. There's an AM, FM, and a TV. And they were looking for a news director for AM and television. And again, this station, the news was very important in that day and age. It was in the early 70s. And I sent I sent a resume, and it turns out that I was like one of 1,000 resumes that had gone in there. And I applied for this news director's position, and I thought that if I could make that jump from Youngstown, Ohio to Binghamton, New York, that would be a major league jump in my career. Well, after I went to a great deal of expense putting together this elaborate resume in a 3-ring binder, all the stories I had covered and pictures of me and all kinds of things, and I sent it to the general manager of WNBF AM and FM and applied for this job. And right after that, as soon as no sooner did I send that out, a couple of weeks went by, I hadn't heard from him. I got a call from WROC Television in Rochester, New York, and they wanted to hire me to be a reporter at WROC in Rochester. And I didn't have any, I had used up all my resources to get a resume put together. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Now, I haven't heard anything from that station in Binghamton. And so I called and I got a hold of the general manager at WNBF in Binghamton. And I said to him, Mr. Close, are you done with my resume that I sent in there? If so, would you kindly send that to WROC in Rochester because they want to take a look at it? And he said, I can't believe that you've got the balls to call me and ask me to do that. And I said, does that mean you won't do it? He said, no, because I'm hiring you. So he said, anybody that's got the chutzpah to do that is the kind of guy that I want to be my news director. All right, so off I go, right? I'm now moving, and my family is just beside themselves because I'm moving. They thought halfway across the country. I was only moving about 400 miles to Binghamton, New York. My dad said, wouldn't you rather have a job in the mill? It's more secure. And I said, no, this is a major league jump in my broadcast career. So I get up to Binghamton, and I'm now the news director. And I had to do some news. I didn't just sit around and direct. I had to do some newscasts. So one day, not long after I get in there, the general manager, Bob Close, the guy who I called and asked to send my resume out, he called me into his office and he said, I've been thinking, I don't like you using the name Jan Leslie. He said, I don't think that's a strong enough name for my news director. And I said, well, that's all I've used over the past 6 or 8 years or 9, whatever years it was. And he said, no, it can't be Jan Leslie. You can either use John Leslie or Roger Clark. I said, where did Roger Clark come from? He said, well, I just made that up. And I said, well, if I have to change it, I'll change it to John Leslie because Leslie is my real middle name. And so that's what I'll do. And so I was, for the next 45 years, until I retired, and even now doing this program, I was John Leslie. That was my air name. So time went on, and I'm at WBVP. I met my wife. I had a secretary. I eventually became operations manager of the station, and I had a secretary, and she just could not abide by the fact that I was still single at age, whatever I was, 24 then, or 25, 24, I don't know. But anyhow, she introduced me to one of her high school friends, and her name was Amity, and Amity and I started dating, and we eventually married in 1970. So that's 72. So it was 1972, and we've been married now over 50 years. We have a beautiful daughter. She is president of the State University of New York at Adirondack in upstate New York. And so we were going along, and I was the news guy, I was operations manager of the station. And then the ownership changed. Triangle sold the station to Stoner Broadcasting System out of Des Moines, Iowa. And so they said to me, Stoner Broadcasting said, we really like your news style. We like the way you write and the way you deliver and put personality into what you do. And we want you to do the morning show and bring with it your news style and your broad-based lifestyle interest ideas. And I said, oh my goodness, I don't know whether I want to do that or not. And they said, well, it's not really an option. That's what you're going to do. You're going to start doing the morning show on WNBF. And I said, oh man. So I thought, well, I don't have much choice here. And so I went over from the news department over to programming, and I got on the air, and it was just so unbelievable how well it fit, like a glove. And for those of you who understand ratings, at that time, WNBF, the morning show, when I took it over, the morning show had a 9 share of the audience, which is pretty big for a medium-sized market like that, a 9 share, right? And so I started doing the morning show. And in those days, I think it was 4 times a year did they do, or 2 times a year they did ratings, Arbitron. I forget which. But anyhow, so I did what I did, and we had such a ball, and people were just responding, and the listeners were falling all over me. And every day it was a better day. And the first rating came out. We had a 9 when I went into the morning show. The rating book came out late. They didn't know why it was so late. They wait around for that book to come in, and the book was late. And they called Beltsville, Maryland, and said, what's going on where's the book? And they said, well, there's some strange things going on, and we don't know for sure whether it's accurate. And so finally the book came, and in the first rating period, we went from a 9 to a 36 in the morning show. Nobody was more surprised than me. Everything I touched during that time was gold. And so when that happens, when you get a ratings jump like that, you become almost nationally famous in the radio industry. And soon enough, I got a job offer from WFBL in Syracuse. And they hired me away to go from WNBF up to WFBL in Syracuse. And went up there. Again, now I'm still John Leslie, right? And this was the first time that I had moved my family. We had a daughter. Chris was young, and we moved up to Syracuse. And it was just first time I had ever moved a family. We had purchased a house, and we had to sell the house, and we got up to Syracuse. It was probably one of the best moves ever, although the station never made any headway in the ratings in a very competitive market. The staff that I worked with had been brought in. They had completely restaffed WFBL, and everybody that I worked with were major market pros. Jack Mindy, John Morgan, Terry O'Shea, Lee Taylor, just all day long. The air talent was just superb, absolutely superb. And the guys and the girls we worked with were such entertainers, and it was a great market. But we just couldn't crack. WHN in Syracuse was by far the leader of the market at that time. Phil Markert in the morning, and he'd sing the school lunch menus and do all kind of crazy stuff. So I was there a year, and a little over a year, and Stoner Broadcasting, who I had worked for at WNBF and had done the morning show, they said, we want to hire you away, and we want you to go to Des Moines, Iowa, halfway across the country. And we want you to do the morning show on KSO. It's a country station. And I said, I've never done country. And they said, well, we think that your style, the same personality, it doesn't make any difference, they said, what you do or what music you play. It's what you do between the records. And they offered me a pretty fair amount of money. And so we didn't have any choice. So we had to pull our daughter out of school again. moved all the way halfway across the country. The house didn't sell for a year, but I'm out in Des Moines, and when I took over the morning show at KSO in Des Moines, they had a 6 share of the audience, and the guy who was doing mornings at that time was not going to be fired. He didn't want to do mornings. He wanted to do middays because he had a band, and he liked to do gigs and be up late at night and then have to get up in the morning and go in and do the morning show. So he welcomed me with open arms. So I arrive out in Des Moines, brought in by the president of the company, Stoner Broadcasting. The program director, Perry St. John, had very little patience with me because I was hired without his approval. He didn't even get a chance to meet me until we flew into Des Moines, my wife and I. And so I started the morning show, and we went out there. Truck blew the engine of our truck blew up in Indiana. Had to buy another car, and so we get to Des Moines, and I started the morning show, and I'm learning about country music. Went in with a 6 share of the audience, and now what's considered a pretty fair-sized market. And first book came out, first rating period, we had a 27 share of the audience, from a 6 to a 27 share of the audience. And as part of my compensation package, when they were asking me to come out there, they said, we will give you a $1,000 cash bonus for every point that you raise the morning show. And I went from a 6 to a 27 in the first book. And because of those ratings, the same thing happened. Word got out, and I got job offers in Phoenix and Chicago and New Orleans and Charlotte and all over the place, and ended up accepting a job at in Kansas City at KCKN, doing mornings at a country station there. And the big country station there at that time was owned by Taft Broadcasting. The program director there was Randy Michaels, who later became and founded iHeartRadio, or was the head of iHeartRadio. And he was running the other country station, WDAF, 61 Country. And they were the dominant country station in Kansas City. And our station, KCKN, which was actually located on the Kansas City side, or the Kansas side of Kansas City, we just couldn't crack it, regardless of how hard I tried. And I did my best, and everybody did their best. We were in a major market, and we just couldn't move the needle. We couldn't make it work. So I was there for about a year. And all of a sudden, I get a job offer from WGY in Schenectady, New York, which is in the Albany, New York Capital Region District. It's owned by General Electric. It was the same as KDKA, which was Westinghouse. WGY was General Electric's premier station. They had stations all over the country, but WGY was the big station. I think it was the second commercial radio station on the air in the United States. And I was offered the morning show on WGY. And so here we go again, right? Now, Chris is like 14. We've pulled her out of school 3-4 different times in the past 10 years. And off we go to Albany, New York. Sold the house in Kansas City. That sold immediately. It was a beautiful home. We sold it immediately. And we moved to Albany, actually outside of Schenectady, New York, in one of the bedroom communities. And so I went on the air at WGY, and we did just blockbuster morning ratings. WGY and General Electric never made a big deal out of ratings. They never told me. Well, they did. I had like a 22 share. I did know that during that early period there, that morning show at WGY that I was doing was the 21st highest rated morning show in the United States. But I never really knew what the real numbers were. And so I was on the air, and man, when you're on a 50,000 watt clear channel station that covers 33 counties, and you got a 3 million cume, Whatever you do works. Every promotion, everything that I did worked. And things couldn't be left alone. Stoner Broadcasting, for whom I worked at WNBF and for whom I worked at KSO in Des Moines, contacted me and said, "We want you to come back to Binghamton and do the morning show there." And I said, that would be a backward step for me. I have no intention of leaving a major market, 50,000 watt station to go back to Binghamton, New York to do mornings. And they made it financially impossible for me to say no. And so we pulled Chris out of school again, sell the house. It was on the market for a year, moved back to Binghamton in 1981, and I remained there on the air, again, very successful, making more money than I had ever made in my broadcast career. There were new cars in the deal every few years and talent fees and all kinds of things. And I did that from 1981 until 1995. And in 1995, I had had enough. I was just, they actually, during that time, had asked me, Rush Limbaugh was huge back in the early 90s. And at 3 o'clock, when Rush Limbaugh would get off the air, then everybody would turn the radio off, and they couldn't, the afternoons, all of the stations that he was on, everybody, they just went away. The audience went away. And so they came to me, Stoner Broadcasting came to me and said, would you consider doing a talk show after Rush Limbaugh's done at 3 o'clock? When he's done, would you come in and do a talk show? And I said, well, wow, that can be pretty dicey. Talk shows are tough, and he gets people riled up, and then you hand them off to me, and I got to put up with them. But anyhow, I agreed. I was tired of getting up at 4:30 in the morning, and my name is John Leslie. I am the host of this program called Talking About Radio, where we try to give tribute to broadcasters all around the world. And so I did the talk show. I got on there and I did it. And when talk shows are going good, when the phones are ringing and the conversation is robust, it's a lot of fun to do. When the phones are not ringing and the calls are not robust, then it's the worst form of human endeavor. And I did that talk show for a couple of years, and I said, I really, really don't want to do this. It just goes against my grain. I used to be the warm, fuzzy Easter bunny in the morning, and now you got me doing this in-your-face adversarial talk show in the afternoon. And I said, I don't want to do it. And so they put me back. I think they fired the morning guy, the morning guy that had replaced me, and put me back in mornings. I'm going to get close to, we're still back in 1995, and I'm going to go, but I want to tell you one thing that happened during the course of that time. I want to rewind back to 1986, 1987. If you remember, maybe you don't, but it was back in 1986 or 87 that Mikhail Gorbachev was the president or the Secretary General of the Soviet Union. And at that time, he was flirting with a thing called glasnost and perestroika, reconstruction and new openness. And he wanted to bring the Soviet Union back into the world economy because everything was just falling apart. Well, Tom Stoner, the chairman of Stoner Broadcasting, was very high up in the Republican Party. In fact, he had been asked, he's the guy that owned our company. He had been asked to be the national Republican chairman, and he turned it down, and he ran for the Senate, and he lost that race. But he was very close to the White House. He was very close to Howard Baker, who was President Reagan's chief of staff. And Reagan decided, or in his communications with Gorbachev, he said, you're never going to have a new democracy or new openness unless you allow foreign correspondents to come in there, because it had been a closed society for 70 years since the Bolshevik Revolution or longer. And so Gorbachev said, "Okay, I'm ready. We'll let a reporter come in here, and I'll prove to you that I'm open to this deal." And so President Reagan, went to Howard Baker and said to Howard Baker, "Get your friend Tom Stoner to find a reporter to send to the Soviet Union and do some reports from there. Well, Tom Stoner came up and talked to me because I had established a reputation for having traveled around the world. We broadcasted from Ireland and England and Germany and all kinds of places. And so he said, I want you to go to Russia. And I said, wait, Russia? Why do you want me to go to Russia? And he explained that this was going to be a test of Gorbachev. Well, it took me about a year of back and forth communication with Moscow. And finally, in late, it was 86 or 87. I don't remember. I had applied to do 32 human interest features from the Soviet Union on the condition that I could do them uncensored, that they would be fed directly back to the States without any interference from the communist government. And so it got approved. All 32 of them got approved. And I went off to the Soviet Union, and I asked my good friend Joe Sobel, who was a AccuWeather forecaster, to travel with me, because I thought, well, what more common ground is there than weather? Because we all live in the same atmosphere. We all breathe the same air every day, every minute, every hour. And so, how can you find fault with discussions about weather? And our other topics were family and occupations and a couple of other things. So off I went, and it went just so smoothly, and they didn't interfere with me. And I'm supposed to be traveling around unescorted, right? I'm supposed to be traveling freely, Joe and I, through the Soviet Union. But every time we turned around, there were TV cameras following us, because the Soviet national TV system is broadcasting to their people, saying, "Look, here's some American reporters, and they're traveling around here, and we're not, the government's not interfering with them." So we did that, and then we proposed to them that we do I'll close out with this and then let you guys all get back to whatever it is you're doing. This is Talking About Radio. My name is John Leslie. I am the host of this program, and today I'm talking about me, and then we'll have some other interesting guests along the way in future episodes. But as it ended up that I had made 12 trips back and forth to the Soviet Union, and we proposed to them that we do a talk show. For the first time ever, first in history, a satellite-linked talk show between the citizens and listeners of radio in the Soviet Union and the citizens and the listeners of radio in the United States. And we put together this really spectacular, complicated satellite system where we had a host, Yevgeny Pavlov, who got to be a great friend of mine, and a translator in his studio in Moscow. I was in the Washington, D.C. studio with my translator, Dmitry Zarechnak, who was President Reagan's personal translator. And we hooked up Soviet listeners, Soviet residents, by phone, by satellite, with Americans. We would get an American on the line. We would get a Soviet on the line, put them together. They would chit-chat. Our translators would translate it. We had 210 radio stations online in the United States, all 15 republics of the Soviet Union. It was simulcast by Radio Moscow. It was in part simulcast by Voice of America. Soviet National TV took the audio and transmitted it on their television network. And it is estimated that we had an audience of 286 million people. It is today the largest, to this day, the largest radio audience ever amassed. And it was just a spectacular experiment for the first time. And the American callers, they were used to talk shows. The Soviet callers were not. They didn't know what they could say and what they couldn't say. And they were very nervous, but then pretty soon it all smoothed out. And we had this dialogue back and forth by satellite from the evil empire to the United States. And it was a great accomplishment. It was covered by CBS and CNN and all of the networks. NBC was there, Associated Press. It was on the front page of every newspaper in the United States, including the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. In fact, right here in my studio, I have on the wall, I have the front page of the New York Times from that time. And so it was truly a unique experience. And, there's that old saying or that old thought that when you die and on your tombstone is the date of your birth and the date of your death, and there's a dash in the middle. And the date of the birth and the date of the death don't mean anything. What means something is the dash and what you did with that dash during your lifetime. And for all of the things that I was involved in broadcasting, radio, and television, that program, World Talk was the name of it, was in part the biggest part of my dash. And I remember that fondly. It was a lot of work, but boy, how gratifying it was. Well, folks, that's all my time here for this program. I really appreciate those of you who have taken the time to listen to it. I hope you enjoyed some of what I had to say. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm bragging. It's not. It's just the story of my life, and I couldn't think of anything more gratifying than the years that we spent together. My wife traveled with me every time we moved. She moved with me. My daughter Chris, she reluctantly moved with me. She has been such a great joy to us, and has been so successful, and she is so outgoing and so beautiful and so alert when she's on television. She looks like a TV network news anchor because she was around it all of her life and she knows how to do it. So that's it for now. John Leslie is my name. My real name, my family name is Kokacek. Good Slovak, Hungarian kind of name, the Austria-Hungarian Empire, Kokacek. And but John Leslie, for those of you who know who I am, that's who I am. And again, thank you very much for listening. And we ask that you tune in again and listen to more episodes as we talk about radio and pay tribute to the great broadcasters around the world.